Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Joining me on the podcast today is Nitzan David Fuchs. He's a geopolitical analyst from Israel. He has his own podcast called Hamesachek Hagadol, The Great Game. He also apparently has a Substack in English. We'll link to it in the show notes. Nitzan has been on the podcast before, and I really appreciate him making time to come back on and give us his perspective despite all the events and busyness that's going on in Israel. Before we get to the episode, I want to give the same disclaimer that I will give on probably all future episodes that deal with this conflict. If you are coming to this podcast to feel morally vindicated or righteous, or to have really solid ideas about who is good and who is evil and how to think about these things, this is the wrong podcast for you. Please shut it off. There are plenty of other podcasts out there that try and attack those things from a black and white perspective. My goal here, my personal goal, is to always to be objective, and then I'm also going to bring on guests who are going to bring their perspective as well. Nitzan is a geopolitical analyst like me, so he also has that commitment to objectivity. You can hear in his voice, though, at parts of the podcast, that it's hard to stay objective when this is happening to your people and to your own place. I maybe could have pushed back a little bit on some things that Nitzan said, but I really didn't feel like I needed to do that. I wanted to let him talk and to give that perspective while also still giving you that general and objective take on what is going on in the region in general. I do just want to say that I thought that there were 2 points that really stood out to me in the podcast. The first was what Nitzan said about how Saudi Arabia doesn't really want to normalize relations with Israel. It wants to normalize relations with the United States. And Israel is just a bargaining chip there. That resonated very deeply with me, and I hadn't heard it articulated quite that way, and I thought that was very insightful. I would also just say, though, in some of Nitzan's responses to how this is going to affect Israeli diplomacy, especially with Arab states, and on the IDF's prospects for success in this war, he was more optimistic than I would be. That sort of stood out to me as well. That's, and again, this is the Israeli perspective, the perspective of somewhere that is there on the ground. So I'm not going to ask him for perfect objectivity here. But again, this podcast, we're trying to get down to ground truth. And I guess the last thing I'll just say is I've reached out to a couple potential guests who could give the Palestinian perspective here. I have not yet heard back. So if you're listening to this podcast, if you know somebody who would be willing to come on to give that perspective, for obvious reasons, my name's Jacob Shapiro. My network is less developed in that space, and people probably less willing to come on and talk to me from that space. But it's not by omission and not by lack of trying. I'm trying to get as many perspectives on the podcast as I can. So if you have anybody to recommend, or if you yourself are listening and want to recommend yourself, it's Jacob at cognitive.investments. Lots of content coming this week and in the coming weeks, both our normal cadence and just trying to give people context about not just Israel-Palestine, but also what's happening in Azerbaijan, Armenia, what's happening in the Sudanese civil war, what's happening in Ethiopia. It's a really turbulent and violent time in world history right now. So on that rosy note, here's Nitzan. Take care of each other. See you out there. Nitzan, I'll record an intro at the beginning, but what's your title? How should I describe you to the audience?
Geopolitical analyst and founder of The Great Game, an Israeli podcast, and recently an English language Substack, like everyone else in the world.
Yeah, welcome to the club. Nitzan, thank you so much for making the time. Before I hit the recording button, I made the mistake of we said hello and I immediately said, how are you? And I wish I had not said how are you, because I know exactly how you are, but you sort of shared with me that, everybody's experiencing that in Israel right now. So I appreciate you making the time, and I also appreciate you making the time during a really difficult moment in Israel's history.
Sure. Thank you for allowing me to talk with the international audience, given the Israeli perspective at least.
Yeah. Well, I don't, in some ways, I don't even really know where to start. Maybe the first question, sort of geopolitical analyst is, how big an intelligence failure was this? The immediate comparison in the English-speaking press, I'm sure this was in Israeli media too, was to 1973, with being caught completely off guard, it being a Jewish holiday. I don't know that I buy the comparison, just because, one was a massive army mobilizing on the border that was ignored, and this was, guerrilla fighters, insurgents. Like, you would hope that all of the resources that Israel has would have been able to get a finger on the pulse, but I don't know, it didn't seem as egregious to me. So how are you benchmarking the intelligence failure here? Was it how serious was it, and is it an indictment on Israel's capabilities going forward?
Okay, let's start with the capabilities. at the last, and then we'll talk about the failure. The main advantage of democratic societies is that after a failure, they learn and they modify and they change according to that failure. That's the advantage of democratic societies, because it's not only Israel against Hamas, it's the US against China, Ukraine against Russia. Okay, I think the intelligence failure, when we finally see it, might be even bigger than 73. Because in 73, you've seen the troops moving, you've seen Syria and Egypt planning for something, and the intelligence army just said, well, we don't think it's going to be a war. Here, we aren't even sure if the intelligence has any indications whatsoever. And that's a failure because Israel is monitoring Gaza Strip 24/7. How you cannot see something like that, something as large as that. And when we're talking about guerrilla warfare, Hamas invaded Israel. We're talking about 2,000 terrorists entering from the Gaza Strip. So, and we're only starting to find out, because at the beginning, like Sunday, people were asking, where was the army? Where were the soldiers that were supposed to defend the line? And now we're finding out that most units at the first few hours just got butchered by overwhelming number of terrorists. So we're still in the phase of understanding what happened. So I think we need to wait to realize or to benchmark the intelligence failure.
I read one article in Wired that suggested that the problem was almost too much information, that there was so many different signals that the Israeli government couldn't actually parse the things. There was also, I think, was the Egyptian government or someone in Egypt claimed that the Egyptian intelligence agencies had told Israel that something was going on in the Gaza Strip and that the Netanyahu government had ignored that. I know that Netanyahu denied that. Do you have any insight into whether that's real or not?
Inside Israel, there was an uproar, but then the reporter that came with the information said, well, actually just one source, and that one source didn't talk to Netanyahu, but the Prime Minister office. So at the current moment, it's fake news until more information will be provided.
Yeah, and we're recording here. It's about 6 a.m. here, local time in the United States. I wanted to make sure that Nitzan could do this at a time that was good for him. So, listeners, you're getting that rare glimpse of Jacob Shapiro without a cup of coffee. So, be careful.
Yeah.
But I know it's a little sort of. But the point is, like they finally sealed the border. Is that correct? It took them however many days, but the articles I was reading this morning before we got on the podcast, it looks like the IDF says, okay, we've sealed the border and the situation is now at least, I mean, not calm in the south, but like we have control. Is that also your understanding?
The way I'm looking at the entire situation is that we have no idea. Okay, I mean, the premises should be we have no idea what Hamas plans are and what its capabilities, and we can speculate what are his plans, what is his current strategic position. But I think from a policy perspective, and the surest point is also for the IDF, don't make any big claims. Mm-hmm. I mean, even if you think the border is sealed, assume that it doesn't. Just assume that it doesn't. Assume that they might pop up from somewhere and make sure you have the troops there. Because we already got surprised once. And, you know, the nasty thing about a black swan is that you're like, wow, that is a big surprise, but I can explain it. And then you forget that it's a black swan. So, you know, now the army is saying we've sealed the border. And then you get another black swan. And then they're like, oops, well, that's another surprise. But wait a second, we can handle it. So assume you don't know and act accordingly.
Yeah, I hear you on the black swan thing, because in some ways it feels like a failure of imagination more than anything else. That Hezbollah was always the bigger threat that was looming, and Hezbollah had the capability to pull something off like this, not Hamas and not Gaza. That always thought, they're going to lob rockets, but there's nothing that they can really do. I want to get back to Hamas's strategic position, but before we get there, I know there have been a couple, rockets fired from the north. Hezbollah claimed some of the first ones. I think yesterday there was actually a firefight at the border up north, and that was Islamic Jihad. Yeah. Hezbollah sort of not claiming that one. How worried are you about Hezbollah or Syria, or Iranian-backed Syrian militants, or an uprising in the West Bank? How worried are you about a second front here, or do you think that this is between Hamas and Israel? And we'll delve further into that with Iran and things like that. But just here today, are you worried about the second front, and how concerned do you think the IDF is about the second front emerging?
I'm absolutely concerned about a second front. The IDF is absolutely concerned about a second front. And one of the reasons that Israel is still hasn't entered Gaza Strip with land forces is because the government is trying to figure out if you should go after Hamas first, maybe Hezbollah first. What happens if we start a large invasion in Gaza Strip and then Hezbollah starts a new front in the north? So it's a real scenario, and I think Hezbollah has an interest to make sure that Hamas continue to exist as a threat moving forward. Because if Israel can handle the threat from Hamas in Gaza Strip, will be freer to handle in any future war Hezbollah. So Hezbollah has a strategic interest in making sure Hamas survive this war.
All right. Well, I want to come back to that question in a little bit, so we'll bookmark that sort of Israel strategic perspective. But you already raised, in some ways, the most confounding question of this entire thing so far for me, which is, what is Hamas's strategic goal? And I've seen everything from, this is the first pawn move by Iran in the beginning of World War III that begins in the Middle East, right down to Hamas had no idea they were going to have this much success, and it's like a dog that caught its own tail, and they didn't even know what to do with themselves once they were that successful, and sort of everything else in between. And sort of, as you said, I mean, it feels like Israel's war machine is mobilizing in a way it hasn't in my lifetime, really, that I have any living memory of. So, like, those are the gears grinding, getting ready to obliterate Hamas. So, like, all of these Hamas leaders, like, it feels like they've signed death warrants for themselves. So, what do you think was the strategic goal here for Hamas? How do you explain what they want out of this at the end of the day?
Okay, so we're good analysts. We'll start by examining the facts, and then we'll try to construct a theory based on those facts. That's how we work. So what we know currently is that Hamas is getting bombed, and getting massively bombed by Israel. And it has not shown any strategy whatsoever what to do about it. I mean, they haven't published any demands. We want that and that and that for the hostages. We're also not even sure that they know how many hostages they have. And we also know that they've taken American citizens. So now the US is involved. And I think today or yesterday was an interview with one of, let's call it, one of the senior leaders of Hamas in Syria, that said that Hamas is also going to demand the release of some prisoners in the United States. So Hamas is willingly pulling the US into this conflict. So it's getting bombed by Israel, and Israel has removed the gloves. Israel is hitting them without any prior warning, hitting their targets, and they're pulling the United States in, because apparently Israel doesn't already have all the international support that it needs. And you look at that, and you're starting to wonder, and that's also the picture that is starting to come from questioning of prisoners, Hamas fighters that the IDF caught. They were not expecting that large of success. They were not expecting to have 2,000 men entering Israel and just not meeting any large force against them. The probable scenario is that they expected some resistance. They expected to take some hostages and then just pull back. And then Israel would bomb them for a few days, and then they'll have negotiations. I have 10 hostages, I want 30 prisoners, something like that. And they got the jackpot. They caught us off guard. They got luck and probably some intelligence failure combined. And Machiavelli would call it fortuna. Fortuna just shined on them. And now they have no idea what to do. Because they have 100 hostages. Israel is not going to stop until they're obliterated. And they have nothing. They have no. Their options are either to surrender now or surrender later. They have no between. And one of the ideas that is not currently seems is that they succeeded too much. They succeeded too much. They were expecting for a limited success, limited reaction, and now they have a huge success and an unforeseen reaction from the Israeli side.
Yeah, it's tough to parse that. I will say that, when you look at, and I talked about this in the podcast I did immediately afterwards, just the gut-wrenching and horrific and heinous videos that have come out of everything that happened. I was texting with a friend last night who was asking me about this. It didn't strike me as very coherent or organized. It sort of felt like, oh yeah, we're going to take these hostages, we're going to do this thing. It didn't look like a group that had decided, okay, we're going to take these people, we're going to take them back to Gaza, and we're going to negotiate. It looked like something kind of much different. You didn't mention Iran once in your explanation there. So how much credence are you putting on the idea that Iran was behind this, that this is part of some broader regional conflagration, that Iran is trying to get Israel bogged down in the Gaza Strip so that they can encourage Hezbollah and their Iranian-backed Syrian militias to go in? Where do you put Iran on the board here?
Yeah, but I put Iran on the board. So again, simple theories. I don't need to assume that Iran has a master plan to understand that if Israel will get bogged down in the Gaza Strip, Iran will want to use that strategic opportunity to hit Israel. I don't need to assume a master plan for Iran to see a strategic opportunity. So the question of the master plan is not relevant at the moment. What I do think, and what I think is one of the main dilemmas of the Israeli government, is how you handle Hamas, how you liberate Hamas without getting bogged down inside the Gaza Strip. Because the Gaza Strip is a death trap. Hamas has, for a decade and a half, probably booby-trapped any building in there. They're probably well prepared for any large-scale invasion of Israel. So you want to hit them, you want to destroy them, you need to destroy them, but you can't get bogged down. And what I think Israel is also doing in the north is keeping the pressure on Hezbollah. Instead of Hezbollah deciding the tempo of the escalation, Israel is escalating and pushing Hezbollah and not allowing it to have the calm and the stability to prepare for another large-scale invasion. So we're hitting Hamas hard, and we're always bothering Hezbollah in order to make sure that it won't intervene. Now you ask what will happen if Hezbollah does intervene. Well, I think all odds are open. I mean, the United States might intervene for Israel. Iran would want to intervene with its Syrian proxies, even maybe its Yemeni proxies, the Houthis, to help Hezbollah. You might have a regional war. And that's one of the main threat scenarios.
Is it fair to say that you don't think that that's what Hamas wants, though? Like, you think that Hamas it was much more of a local conflict. Like, you don't think that they were trying to start a regional war. Now, their goals might change now that they've had this success, and now that, like, the path to survival for some of these leaders is going to get much more difficult. But you don't think the intention was to start that at the beginning, it sounds like.
I think if Hezbollah and Hamas wanted to start a regional war, they should have done it at the same time Saturday night. I mean, hitting from both Gaza and from the north at the same time would have been much, much more destructive for Israel. And then you could both control more villages in the Gaza Strip and take parts of the Galil in northern Israel. So we didn't see them synchronize, and we're now seeing Hezbollah is also trying to understand if it wants to intervene, how it wants to intervene, how it wants to handle the Israelis that are keep attacking them in small scale. So I don't think there was a master plan, but I do think that if Israel won't handle the strategic situation well, we might have a regional war.
Yeah. All right, let's flip the conversation now. And this will be the hard part, I'm sure, for you to stay objective. But so what are Israel's strategic goals now? You've sort of alluded already to, okay, like there's Hamas, but there's also Hezbollah. And maybe Israel will decide that Hezbollah doesn't need to be around anymore either. So it's just about how do we take both of these threats at the same time? Are you talking about reoccupation of the Gaza Strip? Are you talking about decimation of Hamas? Are you talking about no more proxies and militant groups on Israel's borders that can threaten Israel in this manner? What do you think Israel's strategic goal is now, responding to the failure?
I think we should be ambitious and restricted, or let's call it, we need to handle one problem, but we need to handle it deeply. Israel now has the international support, and it has the public support to bring Hamas to total surrender. Not unconditional surrender, but total surrender. And Israel should aim for that, because we can't allow Hamas to keep ruling the Gaza Strip after it invaded Israel. Because if Hamas survive after this event, we're just preparing the ground for the next invasion. I mean, Hezbollah has plans to invade the north of Israel. Hezbollah will see what we are doing in the Gaza Strip, and it will understand that whatever is going in the Gaza Strip will be worse for him, because the territory in Lebanon is much harder, so we need to inflict much more firepower in order to eradicate Hezbollah. And the last bit, and it's not something that people see from outside Israel, but this is the view from Israel. Israel had a concept that we can live besides Hamas terror state in a reasonable price. We pay a few casualties a year, and we contain Hezbollah. And it gives us some strategic advantages in the question of the Palestinian statehood. What happened Saturday was a black swan into that concept. The black swan was showing us and reminding us that most terror attacks end with zero or few killed, but then you have the long tail. You have the monsters like 9/11 that just pop up and kill 1,000 people. And we just had that monster. And now moving forward, we can't ignore anymore, or we can't even think that we can continue to live next to a terror state. Because the long tail is there. And this is not the worst that can be. Okay, this attack is the worst that has been. We don't know what will be the worst terror attack that Hamas made. So we need to make sure that it won't make it.
Again, though, that sounds like you're going to incur... Well, number one, that sounds like you're going to incur a lot of casualties. And number two, how do you separate the civilian population from the fighters in that scenario?
Yeah, because again, you have... Once you declare an area an active war zone, and we believe that every house is a potential military target because Hamas made it into a potential military target, then I don't have a liability if someone decides to stay after I told him specifically, leave. If a civilian decides to stay in Bakhmut in the Ukrainian war, that's up to him. Any rational human being will leave. One of the reasons that Russia is accused of war crimes is because it attacked humanitarian corridors from active war zones. So we need to give them a humanitarian corridor for the civilian population to go into maybe open areas and maybe into the Egyptian border. It needs to be sorted out. So you're giving the civilian population time to live. And then the forces you first of all commit are artillery forces, and denials are mostly handled by remote. So there isn't an operator inside the vehicle going inside. Once you finish with that, you're going to have to send into the troops to make sure the area is clear. And you move grid by grid. Will there be casualties? Probably. Will it take time? Probably. What will be the end result from the civilian perspective? Israel might find itself reoccupying the Gaza Strip. And then you need to talk about what's the political solution after you obliterated Hamas. We can either talk about bringing the Palestinian Authority into Gaza. You bring Ashraf back. And you can talk about creating some local government in the Gaza Strip. You can talk about international government, something with Egypt. There are a lot of options, and I think the political option, there will also be more viable political options as you move forward. Because right now, there is no alternative to Hamas, because Hamas either killed any threat to his rule or terrorized it. So right now, the people of Gaza see Hamas as their government, either because they support him or because they have no other option. As you advance with the military campaign, probably new political options will move forward. But the main point is, and again, this is the main point, Israel cannot allow Hamas to exist as a sovereign or semi-sovereign state in the Gaza Strip. We don't have that option. What happens the day next? It's an important question. But right now, you need to make sure you achieve that strategic goal of obliterating Hamas. After that, we'll find something. We need to find something.
I hear you, although the question that rings true is, where are the Gazans supposed to go? I saw this morning that Israel was bombing the border crossing with Egypt. I guess you could say to open areas. It does sort of present that the variables are all there for something really horrible to happen. But something that I was arguing with someone here in the United States the other night about this. He asked me if Hamas taking the hostages changes Israel's approach to attacking Gaza and attacking Hamas. And my instinctual answer was, we're sort of beyond that at this point, that it must be a very tough decision for the IDF commanders and generals to make, but that you cannot be thinking about saving the hostages at the same time that you are planning to take over the Gaza Strip, that they have to sort of be thought of as casualties of war. You will do the best you can, but this is not the time. Like, they're not going to negotiate for the hostages. And based on all the videos you've seen of the violence that's been done to them, can you even be sure that they're there? How do the hostages fit in? Is the IDF still thinking, no, like goal number one is get the hostages and then obliterate Hamas? Is there any hope for them?
No, there's an official statement, I think, by the IDF spokesperson or either by the Israeli government. We will not cease, we will not stop the military campaign, and we will bomb whatever target we think we need to, unless we have specific information that the hostage is located in that place. So Hamas actually, and that's why the reasons that I think he has no plan, they was surprised by the success. After we started bombing, Hamas said, if Israel will not stop bombing without warning, we will start executing hostages. And then Israel just bombed a few senior Hamas officials to make Hamas understand that no matter what they will do, Israel will continue with the military campaign. And again, that's the right strategic decision, and it's a very hard decision. It's a very hard decision. They don't have just, they haven't taken just soldiers. They have women, they have babies, they have small children. I am a father of a 2.5-year-old and a 1-year-old. Okay, I can't imagine what the parents of children in the Gaza Strip are going through. If they're alive, I mean, those monsters butchered parents in front of their children in front of their parents. So it's a very tough decision. I thank God I don't have to make that decision, but it's the right strategic decision. Hamas needs to understand they have acted like animals. They will be hunted like animals. And we don't, and also one thing to make sure, the goal here is not to punish the civilian population in Gaza. The goal here is not to kill as many Palestinians as possible. No, the goal is to obliterate Hamas. And Israel will do that in accordance with international law, with humanitarian law, making sure we don't hurt civilians unless it's necessary in order to attack military targets. It's a military campaign, it's not a punishment campaign. We just want to see Hamas go.
Yeah, I mean, I can see and feel the emotion in what you're saying, and I feel it too as a father of a young girl and watching some of the videos. But the ugly part of this is the cycle of violence and dehumanization. I don't think there's any stopping it. I think there are people out there saying, stop the cycle. But you're not going to get anybody to stop the cycle at this point. Like it's just kind of gone off the rails here, and it's going to have to reach some kind of conclusion. But thank you for sharing that. Sorry,
yeah, but you can. People need to understand, before Hamas did this operation, Israel was considering growing the number of Palestinians that can work inside Israel, increasing the quota for people from Gaza to work in Israel. Israel was working for the last year to improve the economic situation in the Gaza Strip. And in that year, Hamas was planning its invasion. This is not an organization that cares about the well-being of the people of Gaza. You can't live with that state. I mean, the basic assumption of war between states is that the other party cares about its civilian population, that it wants to achieve some strategic goal, but at the end of the day, it cares about the well-being of its population, whatever that well-being is. And here we have a terror organization holding also its own population as hostages, as human shields, as cannon fodder. You can't work with them. You can either obliterate them or give them another chance to do something like they did on Saturday. And we will not have it. We will not have it.
Yeah. One more question on this, and then one broader question, and then I got to get you out of here. So how long can Israel stay mobilized at this level? And part of in that question is there have been reports that, Israel sent a bunch of ammunition to Ukraine. Is Israel running out of artillery ammunition, things like that? But it strikes me that, time is not with Israel here. The way that Israel's forces work is you can marshal the reservists for, an intense push. But if we're talking about this 6 months from now and we still have 300,000 people mobilized in the reserves, the impact on the Israeli economy is going to be catastrophic. So what is I know that you said Israel has to take its time, it has to be methodical, it has to do all these other things. Israel also doesn't have the luxury of time. So how long does Israel have to do all of this?
I think the IDF might want to make a large invasion in order to get something like a beachhead or base of operations in the Gaza Strip. From there you can continue on. Maybe at the first 30 days, take Gaza itself, working methodically but quicker. Let's say if I'm taking, instead of just taking one grid at a time, you can take 5, 10. And then once you establish that foothold, you can continue on with taking the land. The second thing is, I think some of the reserves have been mobilized in order to make sure that Hezbollah won't intervene. And the question of how long does Israel will hold those forces is also dependent on how long Hezbollah will show signs that it wants to intervene in the current conflict. So if I have to guess, and also taking into consideration international support, I think Israel has about a month, 30 days, for a big push in the Gaza Strip. And then after that, it will have to know how to manage a long campaign in the Strip with fewer forces. Because we can't, like you said, we can't hold 30,000 soldiers mobilized for too long.
Yeah. Last question before we say goodbye. There's been a lot of speculation about how this is going to affect Israeli-Saudi ties, and I've, had a lot of skepticism about Saudi normalization in the first place and whether that's real or not. Could threaten the Abraham Accords, although, first statements from the UAE and some of these other countries actually looks more supportive of Israel than I thought. There have been a lot of rejoinders that, but Arab public sentiment is going to be bad against Israel. It's already bad against Israel. And do these leaders actually care about what the Arab people say? The cynic in me says, no, these are monarchies and kingdoms and authoritarians and blah, blah, blah. Yes, they have to push back somewhat. But if you go back, one of the reasons the Palestinians are in the situation they're in is because no one's ever cared about them. I think back to Egypt, which ruled the Gaza Strip at one point, and Anwar Sadat invades Israel in 1973, the mortal enemy. Also, he can get a deal with the United States for aid and weapons and things like that. So cynicism is sort of the way to go here. But do you think that Israel is jeopardizing its relations with these Arab countries? Are you concerned about all the diplomatic progress that has been made? Or do you think that that's really the Arab countries, yes, maybe there'll be delays in normalization. Maybe there'll be angry statements. Maybe they'll withdraw, trade or something for some point, but that progress will still continue forward.
So 2 points. Point number one of the main reasons Arab states are considering normalizing relations with Israel is because of the image of Israel as a strong, successful country. Successful economically, strong militarily. If Israel finish this war without a clear victory picture, that will hurt its image, and that will hurt the interest of other countries, other Muslim or Arab countries, to normalize relations with Israel. The second point, and more specifically about Saudi-Israeli normalization. Anyone, I think, that analyze the Saudi demands understand that the Saudis want to normalize relations not with Israel, but with the United States. MBS wants new relations with Washington, D.C. and is offering Washington normalization with Israel for that. So as long as the United States is the largest superpower in the world, and as long as the Chinese are not willing to offer Saudi Arabia defense alliance against Iran, which I think we can assume it won't in the near or longer or the long-term future, the Saudis will still have an interest in normalizing the relations with Israel and get what they want from Washington. So you can talk about the chances. So let's say the chances are now lower, but they're not zero. Maybe afterward they will be higher. So I think the chances for a normalization is still an option on the table, because Saudi interests are mainly focused on improving the relations with the United States, and Israel is like a nice bonus.
That's a great point. But to sort of push back just a little bit, or to try and play devil's advocate a little bit, let's say that Israel does what you're saying in Gaza. Let's say it goes block by block. It destroys the cities. It destroys the population centers. It's millions of refugees without homes and things like that. And okay, Hamas is fine. Hamas's fault. They use it. We could say all that. Does that cause Egypt to reconsider its relationship with Israel because the Egyptian body politic rises up? Does that cause Jordan, which has clashed with Israel over Jerusalem and the West Bank? Does that mean that Turkey says, hey, this is a bridge too far, we're okay up to a point, but the Mavi Marmara caused a break between Turkey and Israel diplomatically? What does an invasion and destruction of Gaza do to Israeli-Turkish relations? Do you have any fear about sort of that? Forget about Saudi Arabia for a second. That's sort of the shimmering pony on the side. What about Israel's current relationships with Arab states that are about to watch this unfold?
Yeah. So let's start with Egypt. Egypt, even when we had the Muslim Brotherhood government in place, has kept its peace accord because the peace with us keeps the Egyptians getting both economic and military aid from the United States. Now, Egypt does not have the economy to say no to the American taxpayers' money. Okay, that's a very cynical view, and I'm sure some of your American listeners are going to be a little pissed, but that's the fact. The United States is pouring, I think, $5 billion a year or something like that into Egypt.
Yes, and there is this probably won't work for you, but there is a Bob Menendez joke in there somewhere, listeners, and I don't have the caffeine quite in my system enough to do it, but I know it's in there, just so you know. Sorry, go on.
So the Egyptians have an economic interest in not escalating or not hurting the peace. Secondly, the Egyptian army still wants access to Western technology and weapons and military aid from the United States. So that's number one for Egypt. Jordan will be furious. It will the Jordanian parliament will call for war. It will call for destruction of the peace agreement, etc. At the end of the day, Jordan has three pillars of stability. Okay, first is the intelligence support from Israel and sometimes a bit of military support. The second pillar is U.S. aid and military support. The third pillar is foreign donations going into Jordan that the Jordanian king uses to bribe the different Bedouin tribes that are the basis of his rule over the Palestinian majority. I'm not sure if your listeners are familiar with the ethnic composition of Jordan. Jordan has about 80-90% Palestinian population. And that Palestinian population is ruled by a very thin but powerful, let's call it Bedouin, other Arab elites and tribes. And that's the power base of the king. And the king keeps that power base by bribing everyone in there. So if Abdallah wants to risk his intelligence sharing with Israel, if the king wants to jeopardize its relations with the United States, if the king wants to put on risk his foreign aid money, then yeah, sure, maybe it will want to work against the peace agreement. But I don't see it. And I think one of the points that Israel should take into consideration is we don't want, anything dramatic coming out of the Gaza Strip. I mean, for the first day, they would see like an obliterated district and be like, oh, that's shocking. The second day, it's like, okay, that's very bad. No, but on like the 10th day, the 30th day, I mean, Israel is not going to bomb civilian population. It's not going to like obliterate cities with people inside them. No, we're going to go street to street, let civilian population live, and then just bomb it and purge the area from any Hamas terrorists. I think, it will be for Israeli advantage the short attention span that people have today. Something more interesting will happen. Something more interesting will pop up. Often, hopefully not too interesting, like something in the Gulf or Taiwan, God forbid. But people will move on. And I think that's what Israel needs to aim to, like having a stable state where you are getting small advantage day by day against Hamas, but it's just not too interesting. Exactly like what's going on in the Ukrainian-Russian front. The Ukrainians are advancing very slowly, and it just doesn't interest anybody because, there isn't drama. They're just walking from one defense position into another defense position.
Yes, although ironically, you're describing the Russian strategy, not the Ukrainian strategy. The Russian strategy is that eventually people will get tired of this and will either ignore Ukraine or stop helping Ukraine.
Yeah, and the Ukrainians have put in a lot of effort to keep world interest and to keep its allies, governments, helping them. So, I don't think Hamas has either the capability or, let's make this one very clear, it does not have the moral ground to call for help like Ukraine is. Okay, I'm not Ukraine and Hamas are two different actors, two different states, two different situations. I don't think anyone in the Western world that have seen any of the videos coming or that will come from what happened in Saturday will think Hamas is anything less than barbaric Nazis.
All right, Nitzan, we got to get you out of here. Thank you for bearing with me through the technical difficulties. And I'm afraid we're probably going to have you on again soon. I'm afraid this is not going anywhere. So be safe, and we'll talk to you soon, okay?
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidents podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.